So I'm Brendan Saloner. I'm a postdoc at University of Pennsylvania. And this is a question really on Alex's presentation. So I have a sort of a block-headed observation, which is that in the context of a single-payer health plan with universal coverage, the framework of thinking about avoiding risk is not that informative. And I think that's actually a point that you were coming to with your paradoxical last statement. So what I have in mind is that the general features, sort of in a normative sense, that are interesting about your case would not be so different if we were talking about the ex post scenario. So the way to think about it is if instead of getting everyone at the beginning of the year to buy into an insurance scheme, if the financing mechanism were just one in which we passed around the hat. And maybe we did it through taxation and forced people to pay for the medical losses that were incurred to known identifiable people at the end of the year. The exact parallel set of considerations would apply. So the fact that it happens through an insurance market is just a question of financing and solidarity, and it doesn't really have any direct bearing on protecting people's autonomous prerogative to accept or not accept risk, which is actually very different than the Volvo example that Sunstein, I think, had in mind, in which there's nothing in principle that's recompensable about getting someone to accept more safety than they want. If you can make someone whole by just using the mechanism of financing on the back end, then that's actually not so different than insurance. Then that's not so different than a scheme in which you just make up the losses through ex post payments. So maybe I think that it's a little bit of a red herring to think about this in terms of getting people to accept or not accept certain kinds of risks.
Okay, thanks. Do I answer right away? Or
Yeah,
do I take more
what do people
first?
think? I think we could go one at a time for now, and then, yeah, okay, yeah.
Okay. So, thank you. If you're saying that my argument basically says, look, universal coverage for health is no different from putting in place a mechanism, say, through taxation, which help the worst off. Yeah? That's the way I'm asking you to look at it. Then I agree completely. So in that sense, I think we're on the same page. It's just a very strongly, I think, ingrained way of thinking about it, and perhaps a natural way to think about health coverage as an insurance decision, as a purely an insurance decision, and the government's job of giving individuals what they would want in insurance, right, or what they would fairly purchase in insurance if they had certain resources available to do so. And Mark's work and my work and others is trying to argue that that's not the best way of thinking about it. It's partly that, but it's also about how a solidaristic model on which those who end up worse off, their well-being ought to be improved if we can do so at reasonable cost, even if ex ante, given the risks individual faces, no one would want to do that. Then, of course, the Volvo analogy is not mine; it's Sunstein's, right? And I brought it because it's a provocative statement. Who would want to force the poor to buy Volvos? But if you think about it a little bit, there is the problem with Volvos is they purchase the extra safety at very high cost, prohibitive costs for poor people, right? But in principle, a Volvo is just creating fewer ex post, so fewer people who die on the roads, right? If that's true, then that's it's a prohibitively expensive, but still good way, a potentially good way of improving the well-being of those who would end up worse off, namely crushed in a car crash or something. So in that sense, the analogy works, even though I reject the associations with Sunstein's use of it. Yeah.
Great. So we have 20 minutes. I'd encourage you again, keep your questions, comments short, replies short.
Thanks. Richard Cookson, University of York. I have a strange desire to buy the books of all the panel members. I won't say whose I want the most. So a little gentle comment on Alex's, and then a grumpy remark, which will affect various speakers, actually. So my gentle remark to Alex, basically I agree, very nicely argued. I think I agree with all of your arguments in theory, but the gentle remark is that one of those final boxes, in practice, these insurance packages can't be offered on a voluntary basis. In practice, you have to have a mandate. I mean, Obama discovered that in this country, because of adverse selection and economies of scale and so on. So you might have to violate a bit of autonomy if we're in that box where everyone doesn't, really, the social willingness to pay still isn't high enough. So that was my thought there. And my grumpy, okay, here's the more interesting grumpy remark. Why is everyone so obsessed with relative measures of inequality? Gini, concentration index, Atkinson index, which are, based on income inequality type situations where you've got a pot of income and you're looking at fair shares. With health, we care more about the absolute gap, the fact that someone lives 10 years longer than someone else. That's what matters. Whether it's, twice as much, relativity is a sort of less important, at least that's my not very humble ethical opinion. So why aren't we digging out the Colm index, right? That's a great old-fashioned index, absolute inequality. It looks at the whole spread of the distribution. Why isn't Ole writing a paper on the Colm index approach? So I'm just a bit surprised as to why we're so...
Why aren't you writing the paper?
Well, all right, I will. If I've just given the game away, haven't I? I should have kept that quiet. But yeah, it seems strange, honestly, one can have different value judgments, fine, but we do seem to implicitly go for these relative ones without thinking about it.
Can I say something about that? I don't think it was particularly directed at anything I said today, but it's directed at things I've written about, so I will respond to that a little bit. So some of us have thought about that issue, and we don't think absolute matters so much. Here's a way of thinking about it. If someone says to you the following, you have a population that's been divided, half the people live 50 years, half the people live 100 years. You might think, gosh, that's horrible. I mean, half the people are living twice as long as the other. Now you say someone lives, you have two populations. Half the population lives for 1 million years. Half the population lives for 1,050,000 years. You think, that doesn't seem so bad. I mean, there's absolute 50 years difference, same amount either way. But in one case, people have roughly 49.95% or whatever the number is of what there is to be had if it were divided absolutely equally. And the other, they have a third of what there is to be had if it's divided equally. For many people, that's a quite pressing concern.
Sure, I'll leave it. We can bandy around, different examples.
Yukiko Asada, Dalhousie University. This question is directly to Mark, but I think it relates to all three. My question is about heterogeneity of values. And then there you, as I understand correctly in your presentation, I think you said that the difficulty we are facing is methodological, not fundamental. But I wonder if it is really true. So I think what you said about the heterogeneity of value is that each person probably has different views on how to aggregate in the social welfare function. And I think that's one problem. And then I have a question about that too. But even before that, each person's value, so thinking about which distribution is more equal, and then Larry said that he doesn't know what equity really means, and because there are many different bits of judgment we make, and we don't seem to be really articulating it, even like my view of fairness. And then I sometimes, in some situation, agree this principle, and then other times I agree, but then I really cannot articulate on the whole what is my equity definition or value. So within each individual, there is already heterogeneity, and then I'm not quite sure that if that is the lack of articulation of our, my mental power is lacking, or really it's that complex that we don't have any access to. And then I'm increasingly thinking that then that's the latter case. And if that's so, it's very difficult. And how on earth we can get the value? So is it really methodological challenges we are facing, or it's more fundamental? And then also, I really think on top of that, we think differently. I think Alex makes a beautiful point that, and then also I think you mentioned, Mark, that when we make our values explicit, we say one thing, and then when we think about social preferences or values, whatever you say, we probably say different things. And then in understanding that, is it like, should we start to develop a method, however imperfect, to try to target that social values rather than keep repeating, asking about what you think about yourself? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. In fact, it gives me the occasion to be a bit more specific about what I call values. I was really trying to be application-oriented, trying to see how we can make progress in making real decisions. So not solving all the philosophical problems, perhaps. And so when I was referring to values and preferences, I was really talking about a simplified framework in which the only thing we put in the social welfare function, in the aggregation, is people's individual well-being and not their political views about the aggregation, right? So there are two things, people's views about their own situations, and then there is the aggregation in the social welfare function. So what I was thinking of was to simply ignore people's values about social issues and just ask their values about the good life for themselves. So that's why I said values and preferences. The economists, they always talk about preferences. Some people think it's a narrow notion because our preferences about our life are value-laden. I mean, they rely on what we think is a good life and so on. So it's really, there is a lot of morality in our preferences and judgments and so on. But really, I was thinking of just this, people's views about their good life for themselves, which, of course, is perhaps less problematic in terms of the possible diversity than if we consider political views or values about social life, where, of course, you have very different philosophies of the good society. But I was just thinking about, I was trying to make progress, and I was making this simplification in order to make progress, starting from something like cost-effectiveness analysis toward a more comprehensive, but still perhaps not fully complete analysis of the situation of people and the whole population.
Can I say one word, echoing, answering her?
Very quickly, yeah.
It'll be very quickly. Just, I mean, echoing her remarks, there's this thought that if you proceed by deciding your social welfare function on the basis of what people's individual preferences are about themselves and not their political preferences, you will get something. Her question is, isn't that controversial itself, whether what you're getting is the ethically important answer to the question we want answered? That's her concern, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got 3 people on the queue. I think we'll close the queue, and we're all going to have to shorten our questions and our replies a little bit to finish on time.
So some people, including, I know some, because their fair chances also has some role. So is there any role for the notion of fair chances in thinking about what we've been talking about, namely what gets included in a package in a universal coverage scheme?
Yes, thank you, Dan. So that is one aspect I left out of the discussion, that one might say, look, the well-being aspect, I focused on final well-being. What will the outcomes be of individuals? But of course, the perspective that Sunstein is focusing on, the ex-ante perspective, expected well-being, in this particular case, incorporates a notion of what one might call fair chances, because at the moment of decision, everyone had a 1 in 1,000 fair chance of not of becoming ill, right? That's different, one might think, morally, from a situation in which we already know it's Bob who's going to get ill. In that case, there's a chance of 1 that Bob gets it and a chance of 0 that everyone else gets it. So if one complicates the analysis further by including not just final well-being and autonomy considerations, like I did in response to Sunstein, but also fairness considerations, then it's true that one might have a reason, in my simplified example, to go for not covering the population, because at least everyone had a fair chance, right? 1 in 1,000 of getting it. The chances were fairly distributed. That's maybe a minor but still significant element. So you're right that a full analysis includes outcomes, autonomy, well-being outcomes, autonomy, and how were the chances distributed. Mark and I cover that in the paper in Ula's volume, but I couldn't include everything.
Great. Norm?
Yeah, I had a question for each of you, but I'll shorten it to one question for all of you. So, well, so I respected a lot Larry's remarks about pluralism in his answer, and I'm wondering whether that makes him more skeptical of his sometimes support for an overall well-being measure. And in any case, since Mark and Alex both endorse a welfarist picture to some, at least I thought you were doing that then, and Matt did, then I'm wondering whether this puts Larry at odds with that. So that's a question to all of you.
I can answer the Larry part, and they can. I am at odds with that, and a bit with Toby's remarks. Although I'm tremendously, the pluralist in me gives weight to all the things these gentlemen care about, and substantial weight to them. I just would give weight to other things as well. Now, you raised this other question: is it the pluralism in me that makes me more skeptical about coming up, for example, with a unified, coherent account? This is a complicated story. I won't try to answer it here, and I won't show my own book. But I don't think the issue is pluralism. I think you could have a pluralistic account and have perfect coherence, or you could have a monistic account and have the kind of incoherence I worry about. It really has to do with the nature of the good. There's a certain structure to the good. I won't say more than that now. It can go one of two ways. If it goes one way, then I'll be confident we could get a coherent account whether I'm a pluralist or not, though it may be hard to do. But if it goes the other way, which is the way I fear it actually goes, then it's going to be impossible to come up with the kind of coherent account I'd like to have, and that isn't a feature of the pluralism, I'm afraid, but it would be hard to say more here.
Okay.
Yes.
Last question.
Oh, wait, they went.
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead. We have time. Go ahead if you want.
Well, yeah, I wanted to seize the occasion to somehow finish the discussion of pluralism, because yes, there is the issue of aggregating people's different values, and they may indeed have different views about how to trade off the interest of different people in the population. They may also have different views about what well-being consists of, but that's something which is a bit, I mean, a question that is really tricky when people have different preferences. When people have the same preferences over what is good for them, somehow this can be put in the issue of social aggregation. And in this context, I think that really what I was talking about, and I think that's what Matt is trying to do, and Alex will confirm. What we are trying to do in this context is not to play the role of the philosopher king that will impose his social welfare function on the population, right? That's not the project here. The project is more to contribute to making the debate clearer. And as I said, I think in my talk, different populations or different policymakers may have different views about, for instance, the degree of priority we want to give to the worse off. And so what we are offering is just a tool in which they can articulate certain of their views, and we are not saying that there is only one social welfare function that is correct. And I'm also comfortable with Larry's advocacy for considering broader issues than just the welfare approach. But what I was trying to articulate is just a way to formulate a consistent objective that can be useful for the democratic debate. So some people may formulate different versions of it, put it on the table, it can be voted or whatever, or it can be deliberated in some way. But the idea is not to impose one social welfare function on everybody else.
Good. Last comment, question.
Yes. I would like to thank all of you for this session, which was, for me, the best of what we had in these 2 days. I would even argue that we needed it at the very beginning to inform the others. I'm not a philosopher, but I have 2 very small reflections. The first is that I start thinking that we as medical professionals, or we as health business, as part of health business, or we as development workers, never ever adapted the World Health Assembly's 1948 definition of what health is. If we would have adapted that, defining health as well-being, we would have spared you a lot of thoughts.
So we're glad you didn't. Is what
My second reflection is, starts with a thank you. Thanks to Alex for bringing up that besides and beyond personal preferences, there are social preferences. And you gave as an example solidarity. Now this is mostly seen as a value, and by a lot of people as even a politically loaded, thus not necessarily positive value. I would argue, and some like Frans de Waal would argue much more, that it is an intrinsic condition of mankind. Frans de Waal would say of a lot of other animals too, yes? If that is the case, then the things we're doing now for decades, looking only at personal preferences, at individual values, at individual qualities, just summing up individual characteristics, is very far from the real social world, and it's time to do something else. Thank you.
Thank you. Any thoughts on that?
Well, thank you for making that point, and I quite agree. Of course, especially in the case of Rwanda, I almost put up a quote from the health minister there, because she said in one of the interviews that one key element of the success here is that we don't want people to be worse off. And there's a key element of solidarity, but of course, given the history of the country, which is the history of many other countries, which later developed solidaristic systems, one has to be aware that we don't always have such social preferences. But I agree that under the right circumstances, we may develop solidaristic preferences, and in any case, it's very important to take them into account in the way that standard elicitation methods, like how much are you willing to pay for you to be covered, don't take into account, right? So there, just to reiterate, I agree with you, though of course we don't always have the solidarity we wish that we had with others.
Great. Well, let's thank our speakers. Thank you.